Good morning, everyone. Thank you. On April 17th, the world paid its tribute to Lady Thatcher, the late Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, in services at St. Paul's in London. Today we celebrate the life and legacy of Lady Thatcher as an inspiration to the defenders of freedom, as a friend of the United States, and as the patron of the Heritage Foundation. We at Heritage are honored to be the home of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom, established in 2005. The center works to improve Anglo-American relations, to preserve British and American sovereignty, and to defend the Anglo-American free enterprise system. The center is Lady Thatcher's most significant legacy in the United States, and we are honored that she entrusted that responsibility to us. Today you'll hear from leaders of the conservative movement in and out of Heritage who have a long and close association with Lady Thatcher and who remember her as a friend as well as an inspiration. Like them, all of us at Heritage were deeply moved by her passing, just as we remain committed to her legacy. We are all Thatcherites now. Now I'd like to introduce another defender of freedom, Steve Forbes. Since 2001, Steve has been a board member of the Heritage Foundation. He, as you know, is an accomplished author, editor, businessman, and one of the nation's most eloquent defenders of the relationship between economic and personal freedom. As the head of Forbes Incorporated, he has become one of America's most revered and successful business strategists. Like Lady Thatcher, Steve has never been one to mince words or sit idly by as freedom comes under assault. He has worked tirelessly to turn the insights that he's garnered through years in the private sector into real-world public policy. Steve ran twice for president on a platform that included a flat tax, medical savings accounts, reforming the Social Security system, restoring a strong national defense, and school choice. And he did it at a time when many others weren't willing to muster the same political courage. For decades, Steve has fearlessly exposed ill-considered, dangerous economic policies, no matter how powerful his opponents. Steve recently remarked upon Lady Thatcher's passing that along with Ronald Reagan and Pope John II, Margaret Thatcher was a giant of an era and indeed of history. These three leaders brought about the fall of Soviet communism and the resurgence of political and economic liberty around the world. Like Reagan, Thatcher was one of those rare individuals who were both a movement leader and an effective political leader. It's one thing to have firm ideas, quite another to have the skills to bring them into being and for them to endure after you leave office. We thank Steve for his commitment to these same firm ideas of freedom, and we appreciate his courage to use his skills to advance liberty. And now I think he would like to say a few things about Lady Thatcher. Steve?
Well, thank you very much, Senator, for those very kind words. And thank you, Ed Follner, and your colleagues here at Heritage for what you did for Lady Thatcher. It's one thing to know somebody who's been a great leader, but quite another to honor them in the way that you and your colleagues did over the years on a sustained basis, and doing so in a way where the legacy can truly live on. So Ed, thank you very much, and I'd just like to, all of us, to acknowledge your foresight and your kindness and example for what you did there. Well, as the Senator said, Margaret Thatcher was one of them, I keep saying is, her spirit's not going to go. And at a time like this, she seems more alive than ever before. In business, oftentimes it takes an outsider or a non-incumbent to make a great change. Margaret Thatcher's rise demonstrated that in politics, it takes a great crisis for somebody to rise up to the position that she achieved and to do the great things that need to be done. Her rise was astonishing, especially in class-ridden Britain, still so, less so today than in the past, but very much when she grew up. The idea that a grocer's daughter could become leader of the Tory party and then prime minister, and a reforming prime minister of real longevity, is absolutely one of the most amazing things in modern history. In that sense, she was an outlier. Winston Churchill was also an outlier. He was distrusted and disliked by his party, much of his party, and much of the British public. It took the very threat to the survival of Britain for Churchill to achieve the summit. For Thatcher's rise, it took Britain's utter demoralization and an enormous social and economic crisis for her to achieve her position. It's hard to remember today just how desperate things were in Britain when she took office, and we should find inspiration from that today. Our condition today, bad as it is, was but of a fraction of what she faced. When she took office, we have to remember, she was truly alone. There were no other leaders in the Western world who shared her firm philosophy. Much of her party did not share her firm philosophy. And to go out there alone and start the real reform program shows skill and courage. She knew life did not go in a straight direction. And this is something we also have to keep in mind as we fight these battles today. For example, during her campaign when she won election in 1979, there was a settlement of a potential strike by nurses. She said she would honor that agreement, even though it looked like an egregious caving in to another public sector union. But she also knew you pick your fights, and you pick them when you have the strength to win them. You just don't go gallivanting against windmills, even green windmills, and expect to win. Great leaders do have that sense of knowing when you sally forth and when you save your ammunition for another day. So her success enabled Britain to become what it did. But this loneliness that she had in 1979, and then reinforcements with Pope John Paul II and then Ronald Reagan, was a unique combination in history. Neither leader, and John O'Sullivan and others have made this point, neither Reagan nor Thatcher would have succeeded ultimately alone. Even though she had a firm sense of what she wanted to do, alone she could not have done it. Ronald Reagan, alone in the United States, eloquent though he was, could not have done it on his own. As O'Sullivan pointed out, Thatcher could point to the fact that free market reforms were being enacted in the largest economy on earth. That gave her real not only fortitude, but also the backing and the credibility to continue her reforms against fierce resistance. And so too, Ronald Reagan could point out, already there's been someone in office in 2 years making these kinds of reforms. She is obviously, manifestly, was a very highly intelligent person. If she saw merit in this, well, maybe this cowboy isn't quite so crazy as he's been portrayed by the traditional media. So they reinforced each other. Margaret Thatcher had read her Hayek, she had read her Friedman, and she understood the moral basis of free markets. And that is vitally important. Free markets are often portrayed, they'll use the word capitalism, not free markets. Free has a nice ring to it. Capitalism does not. So capitalism is portrayed often as a necessary evil, kind of a Faustian bargain. Yes, it does give us prosperity, but it does so in kind of a grubby, amoral way, based on greed, based on appealing to people's baser instincts. And certainly in the United States, if you achieve success in commerce, you atone for your sins by giving your riches away. That shows you're not such a bad person, that there's another moral side to you. But she understood that the morality of markets is based on traditional Judeo-Christian values. She understood that success comes from meeting the needs and wants of other people. We call it knowing your customer. She knew that it fosters cooperation, supply chains and the like, enormously complex things, ways of bringing things together for a product like an iPhone. She knew that happened voluntarily, and that brought about extraordinary prosperity. She knew it fostered trust. Instruments, not blind trust, but it brought about instruments of trust. You take eBay, which has been in the news recently. 30 years ago, if you tried to describe eBay, people would say it could not work. Then something along comes PayPal along to make transactions between strangers possible. She knew that it fostered humanity. You may not love your neighbor, but you sure want to sell to your neighbor. Breaks down traditional barriers. We talked about this. She knew that it also had you looking to the future and not just the present, that it fostered innovation. And for a person of her background, she also appreciated that free markets are open to all talents, regardless of birth, and the ability to develop those talents to the fullest. Also, she understood the need for personal responsibility. Personal responsibility means learning from the bruises of life, the mistakes you make. You don't arrive fully, usually, at your abilities unless you're a mathematician, genius, or unless you're an athlete at a young age. It takes hard work to do it. Steve Jobs exemplifies a man who had a terrible personality and had to go through a bruising period before he became a great leader. But in free markets, this enables you to grow. So like our founder, she had no illusions about human nature, but she understood that free markets, under the rule of law, nurture and develop the better side of human nature. So the economic superiority of what she saw in Britain and the United States and elsewhere, she knew came from a superior moral philosophy. Again, putting commerce and morality together, tough to do. Most can't take the heat that such a belief will bring upon you, but she did. It's encapsulated by that word, liberty. In an interview that I was privileged to have with her in 1986, and interviews with Margaret Thatcher were always a delight. Many times when you interview a public leader, they know what they want to say, and that's all they're going to tell you. She didn't mind mixing it up, but she also didn't mind making sure you understood where she came from. She said, "You cannot go on trying to convince people they can get something for nothing, and do not need people to create wealth. Socialist governments assume somebody created the wealth, and it is there for them to distribute. Very soon, the distribution runs out." She went on to say, "For years, we had socialist controls and people forgot how to manage, how to be enterprising, but we are getting it back," she pointed out in 1986. And then she said, "America is an enterprising culture," and this is something we need to remember today and to try to truly revive today. She said, "America is an enterprising culture. You see, everyone went to America not for a subsidy, there weren't any in those times, but to be free to pioneer, free to be self-sufficient, free to make and create their own future." She sometimes understood our country better than some people in this country do. She said, "I envy tremendously when I hear President Reagan say, 'Do you know these enterprising people created 9 million jobs in the last 3.5 years?' Then she paused and said, 'Do you know what people say over here? What is the government doing about unemployment?' What do I say to that?" she said. "We can only create the conditions. Then it's up to you to make them happen." Remarkable. So during her lifetime, she lived her philosophy, and she did remarkable things. And I just want to share with you a couple of stories. One is in the early part of the last decade. We got to know her on a personal level. She would come over here, she would vacation with us, and she also loved lively conversation. So on our boat, the Highlander, one of our guests was a lawyer, head partner, chief partner of one of the largest law firms in the world, and they got to discussing America's legal system. And when she heard about how our trial lawyer system worked, when she heard about how indeed losers don't pay with lawsuits and the abuses, chronic abuses that invites, and the payoffs people often make to get rid of nettlesome lawsuits, she took off like a firecracker. She went after him. How can you allow this to happen? And he was trying to explain he's on the good side on these fights. She was having none of it. And finally, her husband, Sir Dennis, said, "Margaret, lay off him." And she turned to Dennis and said, "Dennis, stay out of this." And then she was at it again. And she had real affection between herself and her husband. And I just want to share with you what Paul Johnson said, because I think we saw it, my wife and I and our friends with Margaret Thatcher. Paul Johnson said, "Margaret was much more dependent on her husband, Dennis, than most people realized. Indeed, without him, she would not have been a great prime minister. She would, at the end of the day, would go and just literally let her hair down at the kitchen with her husband. That's how she got the strength to continue on." Paul Johnson said he literally saved her life. She had a habit of spending half the night working on her next day's speech. It was irksome to Dennis. He would try to make her come to bed. On the night of the Brighton conference, this was a party conference in 1986 that was hit by terror bombings. On the night of that conference, Dennis had long been in bed while she was working in the sitting room of the suite. There was a suite next to the bedroom, and she was working on next day's speech. He said, "Oh, give it a rest, Margaret. You're not writing the Bible, you know." This made her laugh, and so she joined him, thus avoiding death. For the bomb soon thereafter destroyed the sitting room, but didn't touch the bedroom. Amazing. And then came the time of the coup against her in 1990. And the question was, when she had that setback in the first round, what would she do next? Her instinct was to fight. Paul Johnson recounts, but on this issue, the influence of Dennis Thatcher was decisive. He thought her time to retire had come, and he was adamant. He said about the attempted coup against her, he said, "It's not fair, but nothing in life is fair. You've had a good run for your money. Now you must go willingly, gracefully, and immediately." Of course, Sir Dennis detected that she was not the woman she had been. He could begin to see the work had taken its toll. Johnson recounts she had worked almost unbelievably hard for nearly 12 years. Now, everyone says we're hard workers, but she literally did it, half the night on a speech. Nothing was routine for her. 16 hours a day of relentless work. She learned about subjects, any subject. She would learn it inside out. As John O'Sullivan said, being around her was a bracing experience when you worked for her. She always wanted more numbers, more information. So 16 hours a day. She did it for almost 12 years. She never got into a rote. So he realized the time had come, and only he could have her go against her instincts and say it's time to retire. So Margaret Thatcher is no longer with us physically, but her spirit is. And what she did with Ronald Reagan is something we should and must take to heart. So she got a good celebration in Britain at the time of her death. The Queen acted as she should have, even though those two always didn't get along. But her spirit of what principles and a sense of morality can achieve in this very imperfect world, working often with people who don't understand where you're coming from or who in fact will resist you. Yet she achieved success against formidable odds. What it means for us is stop complaining, let's go out and do it, remembering her, remembering Ronald Reagan, remembering John Paul II. We have nothing to complain about. If things go wrong, it's on our shoulders. They've shown us how to do right. Thank you.
Steve, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for what you've done for the country, for Heritage. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce my former colleague, Senator Mitch McConnell. the Republican Senate leader. Mitch is the 15th Republican leader of the upper house of the United States Congress and only the second Kentuckian to lead his party in the Senate. He was first elected to that position unanimously by his Senate colleagues in 2006, and that included me, and had previously served as a majority whip and as chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee. Mitch McConnell has given more than 28 years of his life to the Senate. He was first elected in 1984. We're delighted to have Senator McConnell with us today. He is here not only for himself, he carries with him the will of the United States Senate and its resolution honoring the life, legacy, and example of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. The resolution recognizes the Iron Lady's commitment to advancing freedom, liberty, and democracy throughout the world and honors one of the great leaders of our time, a leader of great conviction who dedicated much of her life to advancing the ties between Great Britain and the United States. We are honored that in the future this resolution will find its home in the Heritage Halls. Please join me in welcoming my friend, Senator Mitch McConnell, to the Heritage Foundation.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. It's great to be here. And Steve, let me tell you how much I enjoyed your observation since you had actually got to know Margaret Thatcher personally. It really added a great touch to the recognition that we are extending today and honoring her. And of course, it's great to see Eric Cantor here and Marcia Blackburn, Ed Fulner, Ed Meese, Niall Gardner. Great to see you all. And of course, I hope we have in the audience the most conservative Secretary of Labor in American history. Is she here? Who has been with this organization off and on for a number of years. This is truly a great idea to celebrate the memory and legacy of this extraordinary woman. Margaret Thatcher was a woman of great courage and vision. She was a tireless tribune for what she called popular capitalism, or the crusade to enfranchise the many. She was a woman who set out to save a country but ended up altering the trajectory of history. And the resolution I'm going to present when I conclude my remarks today explains in broad strokes how she did it and what she did. And to indicate the resilience of the opposition to Margaret Thatcher, we actually had difficulty getting this resolution passed, believe it or not. There was Ed is smiling because he knows what happened. I mean, people on the left in the Senate were trying to water it down and to leave out the things that really made her unique, as if she was just some other person who was Prime Minister of Britain. Well, what I did, Ed, was just tell them, you know, you're going to have to do it in public. You're going to have to come out here on the floor and explain why you want to water down and take out all the remarkable accomplishments for which she was, of course, controversial, but those were the most significant of her accomplishments. I want to thank the Heritage Foundation for the important role you made in bringing all this together as well. It was a good idea. It was a small fight, I guess, in terms of the fights that we have in the Senate, but it really was fascinating to see people even trying to kind of mess up her legacy by taking all of the significant accomplishments out of this resolution. That underscores, of course, just how consequential she was. And airbrushing her story, removing the parts that made folks a little uncomfortable, would have been a great injustice. Imagine commemorating Churchill but ignoring his leadership in relation to the Battle of Britain, or honoring Lincoln and leaving out any reference to the Civil War. We'd never do it. History remembers them because they knew what was right and they had the courage and the will to do it. And that's why we also celebrate Margaret Thatcher. A woman of humble beginnings, she charged headfirst against a ruling class that had grown feckless in the face of severe economic challenges. Despite Britain's rapid decline, at that time, too many British politicians had become comfortable with a simple, uninspiring creed. Keep quiet, avoid upsetting powerful interests, and continue to let Britain drift downward, just a little more gracefully. Well, there's a reason the world remembers Thatcher's name and not theirs. As Thatcher began to climb the political ladder, she saw politicians promise reform for the country only to back down in the face of union threats and sliding poll numbers. And yet by doing so, by failing to reverse the policies that led Britain into decline, those politicians made the country's challenges, of course, that much worse. And so here's the lesson. Here's the lesson Thatcher took away. When politicians lack the courage of their own convictions, when they try to trade long-term national popularity for short-term political popularity, they usually end up with neither. Neither. That's why she decided to run for prime minister on a principled, clear-eyed platform that did not shy away from the tough choices. So, of course, once she was in office, the allies of decline quickly mobilized against her. The reactionary left rioted, literally rioted, took to the streets to prove it was still they, not her democratically elected government, who governed. The IRA tried and very nearly succeeded, as Steve pointed out, in killing her. Even the old guard in her own party tried to water down or shelve nearly every reform she put forward. But throughout all of this, Thatcher herself remained unbowed. She was a rock, because she didn't forget who put her in office, and she didn't forget her mandate to save Britain from its descent into hopelessness. In foreign affairs, she planted her flag firmly with the forces of freedom. When a military dictatorship threatened British citizens thousands of miles from London, she didn't abandon them as many advised. When Lech Walesa rallied the workers in Gdansk, when the oppressed masses of Eastern Europe rose up against their totalitarian masters, Thatcher was there. Not always in person, perhaps, but always in spirit. And she wasn't afraid to stand up for Anglo-American alliance or for the British sovereignty, even when it was unpopular to do so. Looking back, the scale of Thatcher's achievements is clear. Nothing she did came easily. The vested interest opposed her every step of the way. But in the teeth of fierce opposition, she ignited what could best be described as a political and economic earthquake. Britain's once sick economy roared back to growth. Dictatorships and entrenched bureaucracies came crashing down, and grinding poverty lost its grip as countries around the world adopted the kind of liberalizing principles that she and President Reagan espoused. In the wake of this wave of reform stood freer people with a greater say over their lives and greater hope for the future. The success of Thatcher's reforms became so self-evident that even the labor governments that eventually succeeded her not only accepted them, but in some cases actually deepened them. In fact, the current labor leader actually said this of several of her policies: they were right and we were wrong to oppose them. I think that says a lot. But Margaret Thatcher did not just change the terms of the debate or save a nation or give a people hope. She actually changed history. And that is some legacy for a woman who was ridiculed by the elites as nothing more than a grocer's daughter, or as that woman. It's true, she did not just go along to get along, but had she done so, I'm sure we would have forgotten her a long time ago. Well, we haven't. And not having forgotten her, we're certainly not going to whitewash her achievement. At its core, Thatcherism is a recognition of the cold-hearted cruelty of the idea that lies at the heart of socialism, that human beings ultimately amount to little more than units of economic output. Mechanized drones to be managed by a far-off elite. Thatcherism correctly recognizes that humans are more than faceless cogs in a machine, that we are all multidimensional, that we have different talents and different dreams. And it seeks to unleash the sometimes disruptive power of our creative energy to improve not only the lives of individuals and their families, but to ultimately to raise up all of society. And it has, not just in Britain, not just here in our own country, but the world over. These are the kinds of ideas that have led to much more prosperity in places like Asia and Eastern Europe and South America. So Thatcher's ideas aren't going anywhere. And those of us who believe in the power of individuals and the promise of reform, we're not going anywhere either. Ultimately, I believe our ideas will prevail over those of the declinists as well, because history shows that future belongs to those who believe in it. I'm sure Lady Thatcher would agree. And my friends, I'm happy to present to Jim DeMint the resolution that finally passed unanimously after a little back and forth, honoring Margaret Thatcher's great accomplishments.
Thank you, Mitch. Thanks for coming out in the rain and joining us. I appreciate you, and all Elaine has done for us as well. Now it's my great honor and pleasure to welcome the Honorable Eric Cantor, the Majority Leader of the U.S. House of Representatives, and the representative of Virginia's 7th Congressional District to the stage. The House of Representatives has a noble tradition of recognizing distinguished world leaders with the resolution of condolence. When Lady Thatcher passed away on April the 8th, the House acted. In Resolution 141, offered the next day by Majority Leader Cantor, the House expressed its profound sorrow at the death of Baroness Thatcher and honored the legacy of Baroness Margaret Thatcher for her lifelong commitment to advancing freedom, liberty, and democracy for her friendship to the United States of America. The House then adjourned out of respect for the memory of the late Margaret Thatcher. It's my great pleasure to ask Majority Leader Eric Cantor to come to the stage, and we welcome you back to Heritage. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. Jim, thank you very much for that. And I want to say hello to Ed and the others here who have been so responsible for this venerable conservative institution and the role it's played in helping guide policy, influence outcomes for the betterment of all of America. So thank you very much for the honor. Congratulate you on this ceremony to honor the life and legacy of Margaret Thatcher. And in listening to Leader McConnell talk about the things that were behind the Senate's passage of this resolution, I'm here to tell you that it wasn't as colorful in the House. And usually we can be counted on to provide that color, although this time perhaps fitting that there was a bit of solemnity and respect for this great leader in her passing. But it is a great privilege to be here to honor someone who had such a great influence on me personally, but really all of the conservative movement as we witnessed her passing. In 1965, the Majority Leader of the House asked for an immediate resolution when it was learned that Winston Churchill had passed the previous day. The resolution, a simple 180 words, offered sympathy, honored his legacy, and requested the Secretary of State to communicate these sentiments to Churchill's family and the British Parliament. The House adjourned that day following the unanimous passage of the resolution. But it soon became the practice of the House to no longer adjourn for the day out of respect to the memory of a foreign leader until April 9th, 2013. On that day, I had the privilege to stand on the floor of the U.S. House and offer this resolution expressing condolences and providing that the House adjourn out of respect to Baroness Margaret Thatcher. It is fitting for the stature and influence that she had around the globe that the U.S. House of Representatives honor her in the same manner with a similar resolution as the predecessor for whom she had so much affection. As a courageous leader who helped bring freedom to millions and revive Great Britain's economy with free market principles, Maggie Thatcher was always consistent in her clarity to how she approached things, her clarity of respect for the rights of individuals and freedom. And there's no question to me as to why she chose the Heritage Foundation to be the only public policy center to carry her name. Now, Maggie Thatcher, as has been discussed earlier, came from humble beginnings. And one thing that I say personally to me meant a whole lot is she came from a family of a grocer. Her father was a grocer. The stories about her father are of one who worked tirelessly to provide for his family, to ensure that life worked for his family as they went about the struggles of daily life. Now, in a distant but similar way, I'm a grandson of a grocer. My grandmother, who immigrated to this country, was a widow, a single mom, raising two sons by herself in the 30s in my hometown of Richmond. But I know very well the sentiment that comes from a family that has to work, get up in the morning 24/7 and worry about making sure that life will be okay and that we hold out the promise for a richer future, for a more prosperous and more secure and a brighter future. And that's a spirit that Maggie Thatcher brought to her public policy making. And it was extraordinary how she was able to communicate the ideals of freedom, of economic freedom, of free markets, and was able to translate those very basic conservative values and policies and allow them to be received by those who are out there working every single day. And she made the difference because she provided the model for us, is if we want our conservative principles, if we want them to endure and to win out over the other side, it is a key that Maggie Thatcher held in being able to communicate that to every man and woman as to why our conservative principles make such a difference, as to why they can produce the results that make life work for more people, no matter where you sit or where you stand on the scale of economics, in the geography of this country, or in fact the world. So these are the ideals that Heritage fights for every day. They're the kinds of things that we in the House of Representatives, conservatives in the Senate, and throughout the country hold dear and endeavor to promote each and every day. So it's an honor for me to present to Jim DeMint and the Heritage Foundation this resolution that's been passed by the House of Representatives.
Thank you, Eric. Now it's my pleasure to welcome the Honorable Marsha Blackburn, who represents Tennessee's 7th Congressional District, to the Heritage Foundation. Of course, Congresswoman Blackburn, as she's known, is not a stranger to Heritage at all. Even before she was elected in 2002, she was a standard bearer in the fight for limited government. Like Lady Thatcher, she started young, founding the Williams Williamson County Young Republicans at the age of 25, and winning election to the Tennessee State Senate in 1998. She won in 2000 when she helped to prevent the passage of the state income tax, so she's been busy a long time. It was entirely appropriate when, after Lady Thatcher's passing last month, Congresswoman Blackburn was selected by the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, to lead the delegation of the House to the funeral in London. In speaking of this honor, Congresswoman Blackburn recalled how Lady Thatcher's deep and abiding friendship with America altered the course of history. Like her, we're grateful for Lady Thatcher's example and legacy. I could say more about Marcia, but that would be dangerous. As Lady Thatcher put it, if you want something said, ask a man. If you want something done, ask a woman. Let me invite Marcia to come and share a little bit about Lady Thatcher. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. And I am so pleased to join you in the Heritage Foundation today, and my colleagues, and Ed, Steve, always so good to be with you all. And indeed, it was such an honor to lead the House delegation to honor Baroness Thatcher and to be a part of remembering her and recognizing her fight and recognizing the results of that fight and the fruits of her labor, which was extending freedom. And as Eric so beautifully just said, freedom, free people, free markets. That was her goal, and she believed that they were always inextricably linked. You know, as we prepared to go for the funeral, and then as we arrived, we had been told, oh, there may be protesters. But what was really quite remarkable was we didn't see any. And all along the route, along the way, people stood in the rain, 12, 15, 20 deep, to pause and pay tribute and to say thank you. And it was remarkable also the number of times that we saw a poster or a placard of some type mentioning the work of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Pope John Paul. We thought, how interesting. And everyday Britons, young and old, were standing and were choosing to take that time out of their schedule to pay tribute. After the service, and it was so beautiful as we gathered in St. Paul's Cathedral, and you had people from around the globe who came to stand and recognize her work and pay tribute. And after the service, we joined some of our colleagues over at Parliament for a lunch. And how interesting to get their insights. Whether they agreed with her on policy or not, what they did agree with was that just like here, where we have bipartisan debate, and just as there, as they have their debates and their differences, they realized and paid tribute to the fact that it is part of the legacy of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan that they can agree to disagree. And they can continue to have those debates. And they know that it is in that freedom of expression that having that debate on public policy will be able to continue. And we enjoyed sharing some of the stories with them of what they had experienced, and also remembering some of the encounters that we had had here in the States with Lady Thatcher as she visited here. And we're so grateful that Heritage had the opportunity to bring her here, to have her here, and then to have an institute that will bear her name. There's been a good bit said about her upbringing. Yes, indeed, she was the grocer's daughter. But I think importantly, too, she realized early on, as Jim just said, if you want something said, ask a man. If you want something done, ask a woman. And then she kind of added to that as she got into the political field and began to get her bruises and earn her stripes, if you will. You know, she lost twice before she won her seat and went to Parliament. So she knew that in order to win, and to win the debate first, that she had to be confident and sure in what she believed. And that is why later, as she would get into debates, she was famously noted for saying, "This lady's not for turning." When others would change their opinion, she knew who she was, she knew what she believed, and she knew the metal that she was made of. And of course, we all appreciate the fact that iron is strengthened by fire. And she certainly never backed away from jumping into the middle of that to win that debate and to bring others to her point of view. For women, she was such a remarkable role model because she was the first female to become a global leader. She was a transformational leader. And she will be remembered fondly as charting a path that women have the opportunity to handle and to travel when they understand and stand firm, stand solid on who they are, what they're made of, and what they believe. Thank you for allowing me to join you today.
Thank you, Marcia. That was wonderful. Now I'd like to introduce Niall Gardner, a personal friend of Lady Thatcher. He's a leading authority on transatlantic relations. Dr. Niall Gardner has advised the executive branch of the U.S. government on a range of issues. He's a former aide to Lady Thatcher and leads the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. As Niall recently wrote, and I quote, "Lady Thatcher always believed firmly in the ideal of American leadership on the world stage. It was her view that without American leadership, this world would be a far more dangerous place. And in order to protect and advance her legacy in the United States, she established the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at Heritage in 2005. It's the only center in the world that is named after Lady Thatcher. And she set up a center in Washington, not in London, because she has so much faith in American global leadership." Niall received his doctorate in history from Yale University. In addition, Gardner has 2 master's degrees from Yale and a master's degree and bachelor degree in modern history from Oxford University. He appears frequently as a foreign policy analyst and political commentator in the media. Prior to joining Heritage in 2002, Niall was foreign policy researcher for former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Working in her private office, Gardner assisted Lady Thatcher with her latest book, Statecraft: Strategies for a Changing World. He served as an aide to Lady Thatcher from 2000 to 2002 and advised her on a number of international policy issues. Niall has been an invaluable member of the Heritage Foundation, and we thank him for his commitment to protecting and expanding freedom and the center that carries Lady Thatcher's name. But before we welcome Dr. Gardner to the stage, we'll watch a short video on Lady Thatcher's leadership and legacy and her close association with the Heritage Foundation.
1979, in the wake of Britain's winter of discontent, Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party won a landslide victory. The Iron Lady took the helm of a fading Britain, the sick man of Europe, as it had come to be known. But she refused to accept that decay was inevitable and that the job of the British government was to manage decline. Britain, she believed, could do better.
Some socialists seem to believe that people should be numbers in a state computer. We believe they should be individuals. We're all unequal. No one, thank heavens, is quite like anyone else, however much the socialists may pretend otherwise. And we believe that everyone has the right to be unequal. But to us, every human being is equally important.
And while she had no shortage of critics,
the Prime Minister is aware that I detest every single one of her domestic policies and have never hid that.
I think that the Honourable gentleman knows that I have the same contempt for his socialist policies as the people of East Europe are experiencing.
she was secure in her faith that her conservative vision was right.
One of the great debates of our time is about how much of your money should be spent by the state and how much you should keep to spend on your family. If the state wishes to spend more, it can do so only by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more. And it's no good thinking that someone else will pay. That someone else is you.
She knew what Ronald Reagan knew, that free markets and a free people are the best defense against tyranny, and that peace comes through strength, not accommodation.
Mr. Speaker, wars are not caused by the build-up of weapons. They are caused when an aggressor believes he can achieve his objectives at an acceptable price.
America now stands at a crossroads. One path leads to deficits, decreasing influence, and decline. The other, a renewed American dream we all want.
Mr. Chairman, people want to live in peace. Real, lasting peace. The peace that comes from independence of the state and being able to run your own life, spend your own money, and make your own choices. And above all, the peace of a country which is properly defended against any potential adversary.
As we take stock of our choices, the legacy of Britain's Iron Lady remains a steadfast guide.
Heritage is the sworn enemy of over-regulation, over-taxation, social engineering, and a lot more besides. Health fascism and environmentalist by It's a friend of opportunity, incentives, free trade, and an effective rule of law, national sovereignty, and strong defense. And so say all of us.
Hear, hear.
It would be a sad day if Conservatives failed to recognize how immensely positive the results of that approach have been. And it would be altogether inexplicable if this happened when our opponents have reluctantly seen the merit of conservative insights and policies. Thankfully, the likelihood of such folly is diminished every time another heritage backgrounder lands on a politician's desk. Please keep them landing.
Thank you for that tremendously inspiring video put together by our video production team. I'd like to thank Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn for a terrific speech earlier, and I have to say, she really is an iron lady in waiting, I think, and Lady Thatcher would have heartily approved of every word she said, and I think it's symbolic and tremendous today that Lady Thatcher succeeded in bringing together both the United States Senate and House of Representatives, which is an all too rare occasion. And she continues, I think, to be a huge inspiration to conservatives on both sides of the Atlantic. And today we have an opportunity to celebrate her incredible legacy in Britain, here in the United States, and across the world. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the founder of the Heritage Foundation, Ed Fulner, my boss for the last 11 years. As president of Heritage for 36 years, he transformed this Washington think tank from a small policy shop into a powerhouse of conservative ideas. He has been at the forefront of the conservative movement for nearly 4 decades and is the author of 8 books. Dr. Fulner's connection with Lady Thatcher goes back to his graduate school days at the London School of Economics, when he held a part-time job at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which provided free market advice to Margaret Thatcher in the years before she became Prime Minister. In 1978, he helped arrange a meeting between Thatcher and Ronald Reagan while she was leader of the opposition and when Reagan was considering a run for the presidency. Dr. Fulner hosted Lady Thatcher at the Heritage Foundation on numerous occasions when she visited Washington, and has been one of the strongest supporters of the Anglo-American special relationship. He was instrumental in the establishment of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom, which is the only centre in the world that bears the name of the former British Prime Minister. Under Ed Fulner's stewardship, the Heritage Foundation was a home away from home for the Iron Lady here in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ed Fulner.
Thanks very much, Niall. Thank you all for being here on this very, very special day. Flashback with me to January 1965. I was a young student who had sailed from New York to Southampton to spend a couple terms on a postgraduate fellowship at the London School of Economics. And back then, yes, if you were going to spend some time across the pond, you sailed across the Atlantic. 2 weeks after I arrived, though, the greatest statesman of the 20th century died. I stood in line with more than 300,000 other people for more than 10 hours to walk past Churchill's bier in the Palace of Westminster as he lay in state. It was an historic moment for the world. Almost 50 years later, as a not very young man, I had the honor to attend the funeral service for the greatest leader of the United Kingdom since Winston Churchill, Baroness Thatcher, in St. Paul's. Like 2 bookends, the intervening decades enclosed many developments in both the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States and in my own special relationship with things British. As my colleagues know, I am an Anglophile. Niall pointed out it was at the Institute of Economic Affairs that I first learned what a think tank was. That was in London in 1965. It was in London that I first met that most incredible of British subjects, Nobel laureate Friedrich von Hayek. It was in Edinburgh, still part of the UK at the moment, that I did my PhD, and it was in London that I first had the opportunity to meet the leader of the opposition, Margaret Thatcher. Others have told you, Steve Forbes so eloquently, about Margaret Thatcher and her ideas and the role of those ideas and her extraordinary commitment to the principles that we share and that she articulated so well. It was ideas, the centrality of those ideas in the political arena, the ideas of Hayek and Friedman, of Alan Walters and Ken Minogue, of Ralph Harris and Arthur Selden, that caught her imagination and that inspired her every decision and her every action. But I thought today, rather than talk about the ideas that undergird her very political life, I just share a couple personal stories with you. The first one involves Frank Swain, whom we're honored to have with us today, who's the chairman of the Margaret Thatcher Foundation here in the United States. Some years ago, Frank and I held several conversations talking about the possibility of the Thatcher Foundation making a substantial grant to the Heritage Foundation to establish this thing you've already heard about, the Margaret Thatcher Freedom Center. Our idea was not to borrow her name, but more importantly, to continue her ideas in the policy arena here in the United States. Frank was intrigued by the concept, but he told me that the eventual approval would have to come from Lady T herself. Well, lo and behold, I told Frank I'd be in London in a couple of weeks and I'd be happy to meet with her. Have air ticket, we'll travel. Frank offered to help arrange the meeting. When I arrived, obviously Lady Thatcher had been very well briefed by Frank, and we greeted each other, exchanged pleasantries, and she then said, "Let's get down to business." As I recall the conversation, it went something like this. "Well, Edwin, I'm very enthusiastic about the Heritage Foundation and the work you do, and I understand you'd like a significant grant from the American Foundation to start a Freedom Center at Heritage. I like that idea very much, and yes, I'm thinking about a major grant to Heritage in, say, the amount of $3 million. Fulner, sitting silent, smiles and nods. "However, Edwin," oops, here comes the kicker, "as I understand these things, I don't think the earnings on $3 million would be enough to carry out these wonderful programs in perpetuity. So here's my proposal. You may use my name. We will give you the $3 million as soon as you raise an additional $6 million. Fulner, smiling, startled, and silent, promptly left, flew back to Washington. And within about 6 weeks, with the incredible work of John Von Cannon and our colleagues here at Heritage, we took up the challenge. Within a relatively short period of time, we were able to report to both Frank and to Lady Thatcher that we had made the $6 million match. And that was Lady Thatcher's drawing power for her ideas on this side of the pond. We had the opportunity to share with her on so many occasions when she was here. Second vignette, September 26th. Lady T had a private meeting here at Heritage with former Governor Mitt Romney, his first meeting with her. A few minutes after that candid and constructive conversation, his words, not mine, Lady T joined our board of trustees down the hall in our Kriebel boardroom around the corner on the 8th floor for our regular board meeting. At that meeting, the board unanimously and enthusiastically elected Baroness Thatcher as the patron of the Heritage Foundation. As she told us, Heritage is the only organization I'm lending my name to here in the United States. Since then, very proudly, every sheet of our letterhead has carried her name as patron of the Heritage Foundation. We left that meeting. She was on my arm. We walked down the hallway from the Kriebel boardroom, take the elevator up to the roof, where Vice President Cheney was going to speak in honor of Lady Thatcher. We got to that corner of the building. Lady Thatcher paused for a moment, looked at my longtime assistant, Kathy Rowan, and said, "Kathy, now that I'm the patron of the Heritage Foundation, is that my office?" All I could stumble out was, "Lady T, they're all yours." A final vignette. About 3 years ago, I was invited to have tea with Lady Thatcher in Chester Square. I arrived punctually at 4 o'clock. She, Mark Worthington, and I had cookies and tea and a very animated conversation about freedom around the world, about how things were going, both here in the United States, how her friends who shared her views were doing in the United States. Then all of a sudden, she rather showily raised her arm and looked at her wristwatch. I may be a little kid from Chicago, but I'm not really that naive, so I immediately was shocked, acted a little bit ashamed, expressed my dismay that I had overstayed my welcome because I knew what a busy schedule she had, and I should let her get on about it. She immediately replied, "Oh no, Edwin, I'm enjoying this conversation very much. I just wanted to make sure it was after 5 o'clock so we could have a gin and tonic." Light on the gin, please, Mark. We did, she did, and we spent another hour together. She was an inspiring and a principled leader when the world needed real leadership. She was a good friend when our ideas and our institutions needed real friends on both sides of the Atlantic. We will miss her and we mourn her.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fulner. Edwin Meese III is the Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow Emeritus at the Heritage Foundation. He joined Heritage in 1988 as our first Reagan Fellow, the only policy chair in the country to be officially named for the 40th president. Mr. Meese was chairman of the Heritage Foundation's Legal and Judicial Studies Center from its founding in 2001 until what he likes to call his semi-retirement in February this year. In recognition of his leadership and achievements, the Legal Center is now named after him. Ed Meese served as the 75th Attorney General of the United States from 1985 to 1988, during President Reagan's second term in office. His service to Reagan, however, stretched from the California governor's mansion in 1966 to the White House and beyond. In 1981, Margaret Thatcher was the first Western European leader invited to Washington by President Reagan, an invitation specially arranged by Mr. Meese when he was counselor to the president. The visit was a huge success, instantly sparking a revival in the special relationship. President Reagan once said of Mr. Meese, "If Ed Meese is not a good man, there are no good men," an assessment that all of us share here at Heritage. Please join me in welcoming Edwin Meese III.
Thank you, Niall, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real honor to participate in this ceremony honoring the life and legacy of Margaret Thatcher. It was my good fortune, as many of the people who have spoken here today, to have had occasions to be with her and with Ronald Reagan when they met together, and also to have several private meetings and discussions with her. I remember my first private meeting with her. I had been asked to give a talk at Cambridge University, and the ambassador then from the United States to the United Kingdom, when I arrived, had arranged in my program a 45-minute conversation privately with Lady Thatcher. I thought to myself as I was going for the appointment, what in the world am I going to have to talk about with her that will take 45 minutes? I need not have worried. She commanded the conversation for all 45 minutes, asking about what President Reagan was doing, asking what some of our policies were, and so on. But it was a most delightful conversation. Some years later, when she was then in her office after having been retired, it was not long before she had to go into some sort of seclusion. But again, she received me, as Ed related, there, always very properly dressed and so on. And she had actually read up on some of the things I'd been doing as Attorney General when I was in the government, so that she was prepared to carry on, again, a very delightful conversation and was up to date on so many things in the area of crime control and so on that we were doing in the United States and how that reflected on what they were doing in the United Kingdom. Again, a sign that she was a remarkable person and was certainly up on everything to a tremendous degree. Well, as you've heard from others, no tribute to Margaret Thatcher will be complete without a discussion of the close friendship and the close working relationship that she had with Ronald Reagan. And many aspects of that have already been put forth before you, including by the excellent talk that Steve Forbes gave earlier. But as was pointed out, from their first meeting, when she was in the opposition and he was about to run for the presidency, he was tremendously impressed with her ideas, and as a matter of fact, often talked of her, describing her in writing sometimes as a tower of strength. As is well known, the two leaders of their respective countries shared the same philosophical principles and their political values. And they had a similar view of the proper role of government, the importance of free markets, which has been commented on many times during these talks, and of course, the essential quest for freedom. Indeed, in the program at St. Paul's, which was presented to all the people there, the order of service and so on the front of it was the crest of arms that was Lady Thatcher's crest. And on that, immediately below, was her motto, which was the motto that is found on the cover of your program today, and that is cherish freedom. And I think if there's one epitaph, if you will, that summed her up, it is what is there alongside that crest. Well, it's interesting to note, as has been mentioned, about her humble beginnings. And I think one of the things that is interesting about both of the leaders is that they come from those humble beginnings. And yet, no two world leaders probably were more similar and were more reflective of their beginnings and how those basic values that they learned as young people carried with them throughout their lives and that inspired them to do great things. As a matter of fact, one author summed it up this way. He said, "Together, the son of a shoe salesman and the daughter of a grocer changed the world." An interesting description of the careers of both of them. As was mentioned earlier by Niall, Ronald Reagan saw to it and asked me to arrange the fact that Margaret Thatcher would be the first person to visit him, the first leader to visit him. Now, there was, in fact, a head of state who was the first official state visitor, but Margaret Thatcher was the head of government. And so even though Ronald Reagan had made a commitment to this particular other leader to be for things that had happened before in current terms of his country, because she was the head of state rather than the head of government rather than of state, she was able to be the first person to be received by him in the White House after his election. And then actually she was the last foreign leader to meet with him while still in the White House before he left the presidency in 1989. I would suggest, as has been mentioned by Ed Fulner and others, in talking about the special relationship, that while Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill established and really did a great deal to foster that special relationship during World War II, it was during the Cold War that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher renewed that special relationship and carried it through in the ways in which you've heard. I was with them at their first major international conference, what was then called the Industrialized Summit, which had 7 heads of state participating. It was in Canada in 1981. And it was interesting to note that in that particular summit, all of the foreign leaders, the other 5 foreign leaders, from Italy, Germany, Canada, and the rest, all of them were socialists, with the exception of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And so it has been commented by others, they in turn were a tremendous team. They, as we say today, had each other's backs, reinforced each other, and worked together for the first time in that kind of a milieu as a great team. Indeed, they changed the agenda. Up until that time, these industrialized summits had been mostly involved with sometimes abstract economic issues, sometimes practical issues, but they ignored one of the most serious and most important issues, and that was the activities of the Soviet Union, their aggression and what they were doing, and the Marxism-Leninism that was permeating so much of the world at that time under their aggrandizement and their policies and ideas. And so it was these two that began at that particular industrial summit to change the agenda and to talk about Soviet aggression, to talk about the dangers of communism, and to add that to the agenda and to bring the others into a concern. Because while they were socialists, they were also very much concerned, obviously, about world affairs and the tensions that were gripping the world at that particular time. Well, at these events, and over a period of years, things gradually changed on the world. I can't say that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were the sole cause, but it was interesting to note that at the last summit that they both attended, which was in 1988, it was interesting to note that all but one of the foreign leaders was now heading a right-of-center government in those other countries. There was another very important event that has to be mentioned in regard to the two of them, because Margaret Thatcher really arranged it, and that was for Ronald Reagan to speak before the Parliament at Westminster, a very rare thing for a foreign leader to do. And she did that in 1982, in June of 1982, and I was privileged to be there and to observe it. And that was the speech in which Ronald Reagan laid out his blueprint for how we were going to win, the forces of freedom were going to win the Cold War. Now, at that time, there were only two world leaders who really believed that the Soviet Union could be stopped. Most of the pundits thought that totalitarianism and freedom would have to be living side by side. And indeed, many of them had even proclaimed that capitalism had reached its peak and that socialism was the wave of the future, and that democracy and totalitarianism were really just two sides of a similar coin, and that they were two different forms of government that would have to coexist perpetually. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher didn't believe that. And that was why Ronald Reagan laid out that speech in which he talked about that we would transcend communism and that Marxism-Leninism would be consigned to the ash heap of history. Well, they were the better prophets among the world leaders as to what would ultimately happen as they worked together with the Pope, as you heard mentioned today, and together provided the leadership, the spiritual leadership, the moral leadership, and the practical leadership in diplomacy, in all sorts of national security activities and so on, which ultimately led to the end of the Cold War with the West winning and with freedom being the ultimate prize. A second area in which, of course, they also had similar views, similar tactics, and similar results, and that is in revitalizing the economic activity of the problems that they had in that regard in each of their countries. You've already heard about what Margaret Thatcher did in her country against tremendous odds and under a great deal of pressure, great deal of opposition, a great deal of crisis. Ronald Reagan, of course, faced those same problems in the United States. I won't go into all the details. Most of you, I'm sure, remember, except for the fact that he, in a similar manner, stood for free markets and for freedom generally, and for lessening the power of government and for giving more responsibility to people to make their own decisions. As a result of that, the economic situation in both countries were revitalized, and both proceeded from that point forward into tremendous economic progress in their respective countries. Now, beyond the economics, beyond the Cold War, they also shared a very strong feeling of helping each other in matters of defense other than the Cold War, such as in the Falklands, when we, Ronald Reagan and the United States, helped Lady Thatcher and the government of the United Kingdom in dealing with that crisis on their part. Likewise, when we had to retaliate for some terrorist activities by Libya against military personnel of the United States, Mrs. Thatcher allowed flyovers and bases to be used for our military aircraft that participated in a retaliatory attack on Libya at the time. In other words, it was this cooperation and reinforcement that continued even into minor conflicts or lesser conflicts in which they worked together. Now, they didn't always agree. And I remember one particular occasion when we found it necessary to honor our treaty obligations to Grenada. Margaret Thatcher, because that was a protectorate of the United Kingdom, felt we should not have done that. And I happened to be with the president in a room where he had just been talking with the leaders of our two houses and explaining to them why we had to go that evening into Grenada and begin that operation. It was when he had tried to reach her earlier in the day, and when she called back, he was in the middle of this meeting. He excused himself, went into a next-door room in the White House to take her call. And all I can remember, hearing only one side of the conversation, was him saying, "Yes, Margaret, but Margaret, here's what we had to do, Margaret. Yes, Margaret, I know, Margaret." Well, it was an interesting 20-minute conversation, and I'm not sure what was going on the other end in the meantime, but she was not happy under those circumstances. Nevertheless, that didn't have any real disruption of the friendship and the close working relationship. I would like to suggest that something that was mentioned earlier by Ed Fulner and by some of the other speakers, and that is there was another important contribution that the two of them made, and that was the idea that conservative ideas, conservative policies, conservative actions actually work. And whether it was in dealing with the Cold War or whether it was dealing with the economy or dealing with other matters of government policy, they did set an example for the rest of the world that, in fact, those ideas of freedom, free markets, and conservatism generally were successful. And as was mentioned by one of the other speakers this morning, Margaret Thatcher had that ability to, as did Ronald Reagan, to communicate with the people even as the changes were taking place, to explain to them why these changes were necessary and why these new policies were working, so that it was not just a matter of the government imposing changes and new things, but rather it was making it clear to people why this was happening and how, in fact, as indeed it turned out, the people would be better off with these conservative policies. One of the biographies kind of summed it up this way in terms of the impact they had on people's understanding of communism on the one hand and socialism, and of conservatism and free markets on the other. It said, Margaret Thatcher became one of the founders, with Ronald Reagan, of a school of conservative conviction politics, which has had a powerful and enduring impact on politics in Britain and the United States, and in her case earned her a higher international profile than any British politician since Winston Churchill. It goes on to say, the result of their collaboration was the end of the Cold War, the spread of democracy, and the growth of free markets, which strengthened political and economic freedom in every continent. Well, the story of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher describes what I would consider one of the most remarkable teams of world leaders working together in the 20th century. And of course, in this, Margaret Thatcher was a full and valued partner. And that is why we in the United States, indeed the entire world, owes her a debt of gratitude. A debt of gratitude that is due a great lady who has always shown us courage, dignity, and in all that she did, great leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meese, for those very inspiring remarks. I'd like to now deliver some closing remarks, and I actually saw Lady Thatcher for the last time in December in London, and we had a cup of tea at her house in Belgravia, near Victoria Station. And I have to say, actually, we had to compete over the chocolate biscuits. She was quite fond of the fond of the biscuits, and she had two questions for me. Firstly, how was the Heritage Foundation and all of her friends at Heritage, and secondly, how was the United States? She always had a tremendous love for America, and I'm going to speak briefly about that this morning. And I have to say that she was actually remarkably tranquil, calm, cheerful. And my final memory of her actually is her waving goodbye from the top of the steps leading up to her living room, with a big smile on her face. And that's how I'll always remember the Iron Lady, someone who played such a huge role in making the world a far better place. In a 1988 television interview, Margaret Thatcher was asked by Sir David Frost whether she thought there would ever be another male Prime Minister in Britain. Her response, "I think male Prime Ministers one day will come back into fashion." And indeed, there have been 4 British Prime Ministers, all men, since she left office in 1990, but none have matched her achievements. Lady Thatcher was a political titan whose principles and ideals continue to inspire the defenders of freedom all over the globe. Her leadership lessons will energize conservatives on both sides of the Atlantic for generations to come, and will be studied by future leaders in times of adversity who wish to turn their own nations around. The world is a far better place due to the leadership of the grocer's daughter from Finchley, who rose to Britain's highest office by standing up for conservative values. Lady Thatcher won 3 British general elections, not by shifting her policies, adapting her ideology, or compromising her beliefs. She won by sticking to clearly defined principles that rested upon a crystal clear vision of individual liberty, limited government, strong defence, and faith in the greatness of her country. Together with my colleagues Ed Fulner and Ed Meese, and our chairman of the Board of Trustees, Tom Saunders, I attended the funeral of Lady Thatcher in London. It was a deeply moving and truly beautiful service held at St. Paul's Cathedral, a fitting farewell to a great leader who dedicated her life to serving her country and fighting for freedom both at home and abroad. On a personal note, it was a final opportunity to say goodbye to my former boss and mentor, for whom I worked for several years in her private office. I was with Lady Thatcher for some of her last years of her public life and owe her an immense debt of gratitude. She was extraordinarily kind and compassionate towards her staff and looked after those who worked for her as though they were part of her own family. She was a leader of great principle and integrity, selfless in her dedication to the British people, and remarkably humble for someone who had achieved so much in her life. She will be missed beyond words by those who knew her, and her death leaves a huge void in Britain and on the world stage. Like many others who attended the service at St. Paul's, I was heartened by the large number of people that had assembled outside the cathedral and by the spontaneous applause and cheers that swept through Sir Christopher Wren's architectural masterpiece. Tens of thousands had also lined the route to St. Paul's, many travelling from all over the country and the world, in a display of genuine affection towards the longest-serving British Prime Minister of the 20th century. For anyone who doubts that Britain remains a great nation, with a tremendous spirit of patriotism, quiet dignity, and a love for liberty, they should look no further than the representatives of the armed forces who magnificently escorted Lady Thatcher's coffin through the streets of London, flanked by crowds in many places standing 10 to 20 deep. The Iron Lady was throughout her life a leader of tremendous optimism, with unyielding confidence in the future of her country and the free world. She never accepted that decline was inevitable. No matter how difficult the circumstances or how great the challenge, Margaret Thatcher never lost faith in Britain's fighting spirit or the ability of the British people to lift themselves up. Nor did Lady Thatcher ever lose faith in America. In a speech to the Aspen Institute in Colorado in August 1990, she declared, "I am an undiluted admirer of American values, and I believe they will continue to inspire not just the people of the United States, but millions upon millions across the face of the globe." In her eyes, America has always been, as John Winthrop first described it, a shining city upon a hill, a land of freedom and opportunity. There is simply no alternative to American leadership. In Thatcher's words, in the modern world, only the United States has the capacity and the generosity of spirit to lead on the required scale. The free world owes America an immense debt of gratitude for all it has done to advance and defend the cause of freedom across the globe. With good reason, Margaret Thatcher referred to the American commitment to freedom as the linchpin of the West. The amount of hatred and anger directed at the world superpower by its enemies is matched only by the generosity of spirit of the American people and their willingness to stand up for the values of the Founding Fathers. It is because of the enormous sacrifice of America's blood and treasure throughout the last 100 years that Europe is free today, that Soviet communism resides in a museum rather than the boot of a Russian soldier on the streets of Prague, and that the forces of tyranny and terror are still held at bay. Thatcher's partnership with Ronald Reagan was to prove central to the downfall of communism and the revitalization of Western leadership following the decline of the Carter years and the despondency of the post-Vietnam era. Ronald Reagan described his British counterpart as a tower of strength and a solid friend of the United States. Not since Churchill had a world leader placed so much faith in the ideal of American leadership and invested so heavily in the transatlantic partnership. Through many difficult moments, not least during the US raid on Libya in 1986, Margaret Thatcher provided the encouragement and support that the United States needed on the world stage. The job of the superpower, as Lady Thatcher often pointed out, can be an incredibly lonely one, and it is through the support of allies like Britain that America can find the strength to carry out its leadership role. In her view, the Anglo-American alliance is not some outdated romantic notion. It reflects shared history, language, values, and ideals, the very things that generate the willingness for sacrifice on which the outcome of every military venture ultimately depends. Few leaders in modern times have had such an unshakable belief in the greatness of the United States, the spirit of its people, and its ability to lead. To Lady Thatcher, America was and still remains a truly exceptional nation, one founded on the principles of individual liberty, enshrined in a constitution that protects the rights of all of its citizens. As the Iron Lady put it, the United States is the greatest country in the free world, a country born to be free, one with an awesome responsibility. Great Britain and the world were immeasurably changed for the better by Margaret Thatcher's leadership. It is now up to her supporters to defend her legacy and to advance the ideals and principles for which she fought. Britain and America's future as free nations depend upon it. I would like to thank Senator DeMint, Senator McConnell, Congressman Cantor, Congresswoman Blackburn, Ed Fulner, and Ed Meese for their wonderful remarks today. Thank you again to everyone here for joining us for this wonderful occasion to remember and celebrate the legacy of a truly great leader. On behalf of the Heritage Foundation, it has been a tremendous privilege to host you here, and I look forward to seeing you all back here at Heritage in the coming weeks and months. Thank you very much.